Right, and we're recording. So, this is the Coach Support Show. We're going to be breaking down topics once a week. We're going to look at questions that you might have. We're going to look at news or books or basically whatever we want to talk about coaching. Hopefully, this will be useful for you no matter the esport that you're in, no matter the game that you're involved with. And we'll just get straight into it. So, today we have a couple of questions that we will get to later. But the first thing that we want to talk about is a bit of news almost. So, Riot have recently announced that they're going to be, I think the words they're using was trying to make a multiplayer practice tool. But for the sake of this, we'll assume that they can. So, I'll just give a bit of background so that everyone can be on the same page no matter the game. And then I'd love to get your thoughts on it. So, currently we have a single player practice tool. You can go in, you're on the same map as normal. I'll explain it as if you don't know League of Legends. And you can do things like give yourself infinite gold. You can reset all your cooldowns. You can reset all your resources so that you can keep spamming stuff. And you can basically try things out. Now, from my point of view, this isn't at the moment particularly useful for pro teams. Now, that might be a controversial statement. There might be people who disagree with me. But from my point of view, if you got rid of it, I don't think we'd see like a massive drop off in quality. There are a few uses for it though. The first is that you can use it to test builds and runes. So you can basically test how much damage I'm going to do with these items and then change my items. How much damage do I do with these? You can test combos. That's a really big one. Whenever a new champion comes out, really good thing to do if you're coaching a team. Take that champion into practice tool and just spam all the things. Okay, what can I animation cancel? What can I change the direction of? If I flash when I ult, does it actually move from a different place? You know, all those kind of things. The next would be to practice combos. If there are specific combos that you want to build up some muscle memory of, that can be really useful. And the last will be warming up. So you'll quite often see on the LEC stage, for example, or in LFL days, people just going into practice tool, classic one, Draven, just trying to catch axes, all those kind of things. So they haven't said exactly how this multiplayer practice tool would work. Now, for the sake of this discussion, I think we should assume at least it's going to be the same, but with 10 people in. If they put 4 people in and say it's multiplayer, that's not going to help pro teams really at all. It will help people who are testing bugs and things like that. So we'll assume at least 10 players and not that you can do absolutely anything. So I think that's all the background we need. But what are your thoughts on this from both a theoretical and just your opinion standpoint? What do you think this is going to do to pro teams?
Yeah. So I think, well, I'm really glad you gave your take on what it might be, because I was wondering how much is going to be controllable here. And I think, assuming that it's 5v5, assuming that you can have all that controllability, uh, my initial impression, just by scanning social media and reading what little there is out there about it, I picked up what to me were maybe 2 red flags, 2 interesting points to consider around implementation of it, and something relating to what I would consider a coaching fundamental.
Hmm.
So
Let's do it one by
maybe
one.
from the
What's
yeah,
your
maybe
first
maybe
red
from the
flag?
top. My first red flag was seeing comments about the idea of repetition and drilling.
Mm.
So I think in a few interactions online, people sharing their thoughts about it, I saw a lot of people looking or thinking quite positively about the idea of repetition and being able to drill, repeat a scenario, and then hinting at that being proven to be the best way to improve. Um,
I love the
yeah,
word proven when it gets dropped in this kind of context, by
yeah,
the way. I think we're constantly adapting, we're constantly evolving. I think anything that you can quote unquote prove now, you can't think of as solid. Okay, so
yeah.
what's the problem with this then? What's the problem with the idea that okay, it's great that we can break things down. Now I can just drill this same thing 100 times and I'll be good at it.
Yeah, so it's a very, I mean, the criticisms in the world of sport coaching research, criticisms of, if you think about the history of sports coaching and research being like a 100-year timeline, probably for the first 80 years, there's been this, not maybe that's, actually we're in 2024, let's say 70 years, there has been this kind of ethos of military drill instructor style coaching where we set up some equipment, we rehearse a movement pattern, and we repeat that over and over again until we perfect it, and then we can implement it into competition. And contemporary thoughts on sport coaching is that it doesn't quite work like that. And actually, without digging too much into the weeds of it, if you looked at like the highest performers in many domains and what their week looks like and how they train, probably the primary takeaway or the primary aspect that you'd notice is variation in what they do and how they do it. So it's the idea of isolating a skill or a movement pattern down to one particular mode or function or activity, and doing that until you can't do it anymore. You don't. That's not really
Mm.
how we train uh, for high performance anymore. In fact, yes, you can see clips of basketball players putting up shots in conditions where it's quite sanitized, so no defenders or anything like that, and you can see them doing that over and over and over again. What we're not seeing is that they also practice against defenders. They practice in situations where they're outnumbered. They do a lot of work in the gym and on holistic health and lifestyle, and their week is full of variety. And just seeing on the surface of esports right now, this idea that we would want to use this practice tool to put our team through a repeated attempt to tackle a situation for hours on end,
Mm.
if that's what was implied by repetition and drilling a scenario, that is a red flag,
Okay.
I would
Okay.
suggest.
Yeah, I think that's the interesting point as well, which I hadn't really considered when people were talking about this. Because for me, I've said publicly, and I will stand by, I think it's going to be absolutely fantastic. And I would be very excited to see how it's implemented and get a chance to work with it myself. But the main reason is the opposite. It's so that we can
Right,
have more variety. Because
right.
currently, the problem that we have is that we have no control over the practice environment at all. So we can't break down anything. It's like if we take the basketball example, the only way we can practice is to play a full game with another team that we bring
Yeah,
in. And now we have the chance to bring them in, but also say, okay, we're going to hopefully be able to just practice free throws or something like that. One of the things that I just thought of, I don't know if it ever applies to something like League of Legends, is you're talking about breaking skills down. Is there a chance we can break stuff down too much? So if you have something like a shot in basketball, it's probably not worth to practice just the pullback of the shot and not actually throw the ball over and over again. Is that something that's ever worth considering if we don't have such a simple way to kind of isolate a skill, or like the backswing of a golf swing? That's probably not worth practicing. Like you could practice the whole swing in isolation, but the thing is, in League of Legends, there's not such a clear
yeah,
start and end to the play because there's no ball, there's no focus point, so it's kind of all happening at once.
yeah. You're asking the right questions, and there's a whole school of well, a whole field of research dedicated to understanding, how we develop and acquire skills. And there's emerging work done in esports. But you're right, like breaking things down too much so that they no longer represent what happens in the real competitive situation appears to be somewhat detrimental, because there is you're practicing to do that bit part of a skill, and then you apply it into context, and suddenly you're overwhelmed with all this other information that you weren't used to. So yeah, certainly that's a concern. And this idea of, I mean, in a game like League of Legends, like the representativeness of what you're training. So even if you wanted to set up a scenario and practice something specific, the game is so complex. I mean, the infinite combination of champions, items, game state it's unlikely that exact thing will come up again. So if you isolate one part of that, how useful is that
Mm,
really? So
okay.
yeah, there is this. Yeah, it's
Mm,
we haven't. I mean, it hasn't been cracked in sports coaching research, but it's certainly a fine balance between too much reductionism, breaking things down too much so that they're completely detached from a game situation, and then you leave a performer in a position where they enter into that competition and it's overwhelming.
mm,
But also, that noise is also not particularly useful for learning at some levels.
mm,
So
mm. Okay.
delicate.
It's really interesting. I should have explained at the top, the way we're approaching this show is we're gradually deciding on topics throughout the week, either things that we want to talk about or things that come up like this. And then we're preparing completely separately. Actually prepared almost some counter arguments to you saying we
Awesome.
should break stuff down because I thought
Yeah.
you were going to say we should absolutely just break everything down. It would be great. I thought you were going to be saying we should drill all this stuff, all that kind of thing. And my points were going to be about, is how much is repetition too much? Okay, so but so that's the first red flag. Something we
Yeah.
would definitely agree on, but is it an interesting discussion? What are your next points? Maybe let's go through all of them because
Okay.
otherwise I'm going to keep interrupting you and we're never going to get to all of them. So do all your points on it, and then I'll
Okay.
I'll come in and we can have a chat about it.
Yeah. By the way, I am in favor. I mean, there is repetition that will be worth
Mm.
doing. It's just, yeah, relentless synthetic, not synthetic, but sanitized replication might be counterintuitive. Red flag number two: adoption of it. So this was more a, we know that a lot of current practices in esports are done because that's how it's always been done, and there is a lot of resistance sometimes to new ways of doing things. You've experienced that yourself as a head coach, and yeah, we're seeing that quite often, and that's understandable, right? We don't have a great deal of alternatives that have like a great deal of evidence to challenge things that may be popular out in the best leagues in the world. But it's interesting just to see that there seem to be two camps. The one camp is maybe more of the player voice about how this will be useless if my coach dares introduce this in a scrim block. I'm gonna leave because it's not worth my time, and I'm not going to be learning, and it's not going to translate to my performance in game. Um, on the other, and that's risky, right? Because if the game developer doesn't see or doesn't get feedback that it's useful and being adopted, then maybe they just drop it or stop updating it, which could be a problem. And then on the other side of it, you've got, I think, a couple of coach voices who think, "Oh, great, this affords me more control. I can tinker. I can have more of a say. I can take more of the bandwidth of the training session, of the scrim block." And that also is perhaps a red flag, because I'm a big believer in, we've got to distribute that leadership a little bit, voice and a choice to all members of the team. And this could be another tool to take control away. So two camps forming. I don't know if you're seeing the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's I haven't really done enough research in terms of what the general consensus is. So I just talked to individual people. But I think I completely agree with that. I think I definitely fall into that second camp.
Right.
But I'm hoping in slightly more of a mature way than what you're
Right.
meaning there. But still, for me, I think it's um, a big positive to be able to have more control on the practice environment. Not
Yep.
that I would exert it all the time, but even to just have it as an option that you almost never use is still better than not having it as an option. I
Yes.
can get into some more of the details of that, but then you had some other points as well.
Yeah. So 2 points of implementation. One would be assuming that I'm right in saying that whatever we isolate to work on, or whatever scenario we choose to work on in the multiplayer tool, assuming that would never, or would be just the chances of it replicating into a future game, or coming up in an identical way in a future game, assuming that is just the chances of that are just infinitesimally small. Very, the implementation has to be aware of what is our purpose for using this. Are we trying to use it for like creating plays where if we see this constellation of things, we do these things, or is it for learning more abstract concepts and strategy, and even developing just maybe more psychological resources around what's it like to play against a Draven that's 2 levels up or 3 levels up, and can we develop strategies that might not be like game specific? They could be around just ways of thinking and communicating to work around that, and be more adaptive in our problem solving. Those could be really, really fun, and those could transfer to future games. But I think just the implementation might need to be aware of the unlikelihood that that exact thing you want to replicate
Mm.
isn't is unlikely to come up in that exact same form in future.
But doesn't that happen already? So when we play a scrim, the chances of anything that happens in that scrim happening exactly like that are zero. Like it might as well be zero. There will be things that happen similar to that. It's like the example I always give is if you're into chess, there's a channel called Agadmator who looks over chess games. And he always mentions the moment that it becomes a completely new game, a completely
Mhm.
new professional game, no more games in the
Nice.
database. And obviously, the database goes back a long time. There are a lot of people playing chess, but it's always like and now as of move 5, we have a completely new game, or now as of move 6. There's a couple where it's like as of move 4, we have a completely
Yep.
new game, but it's never double digits, almost ever, despite the fact that opening theory you would say is almost solved. If you did that in League of Legends, it would be like now as of second 3, we have a completely new game. Or even if you just said, okay, going to lanes means the same, then as of the first wave, every game would be different. So whenever you're playing and you talking about, okay, we set up this second dragon in a certain way, we should have done a different way, it's never going to happen exactly the same again. So
Mhm.
isn't that a problem that's already happening? Except from now we take an hour to get one example of everything, whereas this
Yeah.
might be a way to take an hour to get 10 examples of the same thing, even though
Yes.
they're all going to be different.
I think you're 100% right. It's more I feel like there's a temptation for the
Mm,
coach to believe
right.
because I can replay it
We
over
could
and
trick
over again.
ourselves.
We can trick ourselves because we can perfect it in the training tool,
Mm,
but we're perfecting it, great. It's never gonna come up again. So I think it's
mm,
just a temptation to replay it, rather than work on those more generalizable, transferable, abstract
mm,
ideas.
mm.
So that's just an implementation point, not saying it's gonna be that way, but it's sort of understanding why we're gonna use it. Um, Other side of that same coin is great, really fun ways to use it. So, creating a scenario where there is an obvious disadvantage to your team, and you've got to figure out ways to work around it. I've sort of already alluded to it, but I just think um, empowering players to feel like, okay, we're down but not out, and the you always, I mean, the huge goal differences. Can we find a way to like climb back in? And are there better ways for us to do that or not, or and things like
Mm.
that? So I think opportunity there, really fun opportunity. And then finally, coaching fundamentals. I think you've got to have a strong rationale for why you're using it. It critical, obviously, and you have to use all of the skills you've got in your coaching toolbox to help your players get on board with that reasoning. And I mean, I've seen this in practice, and I've seen it like people I think I consider great coaches introduce an idea, players don't like it after one session, and it never gets done again.
Yeah.
And I think all of that has to you're gonna a lot of coaches will probably experience that
Yeah.
massively at the beginning. So
Yeah. Yeah.
those are my
I
thoughts.
think it's really, really good. I think it's interesting. So much of the work that I've done over the last few years, and I know the work you do as well, is about letting coaches have more impact. It's not
Right.
about, training or anything like that. It's just supporting them to have more of an impact on their team. But the kind of downside of that is that the more impact you have, if you're wrong, you'll also have a bigger negative impact. It's like if we
Yeah.
just scrim and I just point out the things we did badly, then yeah, I'm not going to be particularly efficient and I might not particularly be able to shape this team to play the way that I want to play. But if the way that I want to play is wrong and I make them play it exactly, then that's worse. So
Yeah.
even this idea of, because it's interesting, I've seen so many coaches go on this journey of like gradually being like getting more familiar with all these tools and all the ways that they can impact the team and realizing that they can have so much more of an impact, which is great. But then you say, okay, right, step by step, we identify a problem, then we build a plan of how we're going to teach the team to deal with that problem, then we implement it and we review it.
Mhm.
But the more impact you have, if you're wrong even about that identification stage, and I'm sure that late game is our problem, and so now I can actually even set up a practice tool. So we practice late game primarily, and late game wasn't our problem. If I'm wrong, it's much worse than it used to be. So I do think it's an interesting kind of dynamic.
Absolutely. I mean, that's also like you said a few times, like it's not I can't imagine that's unique to the esports space. Like if,
Mm,
like a basketball, American football, if you practice a special play for an entire day of practice and that scenario never comes up, like you look a bit of a plum. But yeah, no, I mean,
mm,
you're deciding this is how we're going to use our practice time. You're taking a bigger portion of the accountability, I suppose. Yeah.
yeah. Okay. So I'll say a few. I think I'm more. positive about this, but I do actually think we agree
I'm positive
on
about
a
it.
lot
I
of
think
things.
it's yes, no, I'm
Okay.
positive about it. I mean, stemming from my first point about the variability.
Mm.
So we know it's just like emotionally psychological draining for players to have to play
It's super boring.
5 plus games. Boring, right? It's hard work to just play full games that much across the course of a day, and actually having something else to lean on,
Mm.
variability, I think is
Mm.
great. So,
Yeah.
anyway.
Yeah, I think we agree on a lot of stuff. Like I said, I was sort of prepared to be like, okay, yeah, but would it work in practice? Is it going to be how different is it
Right.
going to be? All that kind of stuff. But what we can say that I think we definitely agree on is that, or from my point of view, I guess I should say, the biggest positive, and I think I tweeted something like it's also going to set coaches apart. The coaches who know more about coaching
Yeah,
should be more rewarded, which is a great
true.
thing, I think, and good for the scene. But one of the reasons why is because if you can identify that problem and you can find a good way of working on it, and that's a very important step, then you do actually have a lot more control of it. So what we do in the moment in the practice tool is you have this thing where you can advance the game by 30 seconds. Now, I hope this isn't the system that they stick with. I mean, I know absolutely nothing about coding, but I'm assuming it's not just like we're just going to flip a switch and turn the thing that was single player into a multiplayer thing. I'm assuming they're going to have to build it up from scratch. So I'm hoping, my absolute fingers crossed, that we get to sort of choose the time of the game
Mm,
and we get to choose what towers are down. I think that those would be two big things, and then what we've already got. You just give me that, and I'm super happy. But even with the idea of just standing in base and going skip forward 30 seconds, skip forward 30 seconds until you reach your right moment, that for me is the real key
mm,
because there's so much variation in League of Legends, and it's like branching out, gradually getting wider and wider. By the time you get to later stages of the game, it's just it's just too big. There's just too many variables. So you won't have got to there to practice. So a
mm,
more kind of concrete example that I can talk about from when I was in the LEC, we put together a team, which I guess, it was very last minute, but we would have started practicing in definitely December, maybe November, coming into most of January, I think, before the first game, because it was two splits still at that point. So scrimming a lot, doing the full game together, trying to do some sort of drills, but you don't have all that much control. Then we come to our very first game, which was against G2. Now, at the time, G2 were just a good team. This was actually the year that they did their absolute mega run, one MSI, all that kind of stuff. This was oh my goodness, they really are that good. But we were winning the game. And we were winning the game until sort of 30, 35 minutes. And then we made a couple of really stupid decisions and lost the game. And Caps, I think, 1v3 people at one point. But that's a separate issue. I don't
classic.
think practice still stops Caps from doing that. But actually, when we go back through, we had never played a scrim game that went beyond 30 minutes.
Mm,
They'd literally just never reached that moment. So we had never, ever been in this situation as a team, let alone in this situation on stage.
yeah,
If I could just say, right, we're going to play a normal game that starts at 20 minutes. You're going to have the average gold that an AD carry has at 20 minutes. Enemy's going to have the exact same. Support's going to have less, obviously, but exactly the average that a support has. And we can just play out the game from now, even game state at 20 minutes. What happens? Because scrims almost never get to 20 minutes without being pretty much won or lost. And
yeah,
yet, some of the most crucial objectives that exist, the third dragon, fourth dragon, elders, barons, all come up later on into the game.
yeah,
So for me, that's just an absolutely huge one where we can say, okay, right, for the first 3 games of the day, we're going to play just full game. But for the last 3 after our break, we're going to play 20-minute games. Now, if you had more control, then I think it would be great to be able to say, right, how do we close out a game when we've got a split pushing composition? And we can kind of practice that. But for me, I think the way that I see this kind of breaking down is maybe a lot wider than we were talking about before. It's not let's practice a single free throw if we're or a single shot if we're taking the basketball example, but maybe we can practice attack, and then when we're done, we can practice attack again, rather than having
mhm,
to defend because the enemy team has the ball.
yeah,
So it's that kind of breaking it down where we're breaking down into huge chunks rather than breaking down into
yes.
individual specific skills.
That sounds very healthy, that application of it. Not not X's and O's type thinking. Like, I'm watching you, I'm the coach, I'm watching the players, and I need you to move to this bush and I'm watching the exact like efficiency of how like your precision of where you're clicking. Like, uh, yeah, I don't think I think that's too granular. What you're talking about sounds very healthy. What would be what would be a take like a, a takeaway point from if you were practicing sort of late game with a split pushing comp? What would be like a takeaway that you might want, or a learning point that you might want to take away from that?
Well, the big things will be, I mean, I don't know how specific to get, but for example, if we're playing a split pushing composition, it's going to be not only what are we doing with the waves in all the side lanes, but how
Right,
we communicate. Those kind of
right,
things are going to be really
right.
crucial. I think maybe actually a kind of simpler way to talk about this, especially for people who don't know League of Legends. I'm conscious I want this to, as much as possible, apply to elsewhere, but it's all about the tools that you have, right? So if we take Baron as an example, I think that might be a better example. So let's say your team really struggles with setting up Baron, or you've never covered it before, and you want to
Right.
talk about how we should set this up. So you might do uh, presentations before the scrims, or you might do a gradually more in-depth presentation throughout the day. You start with just some vague things. We're going to talk about Baron today. Then once you've done it once, you can say, okay, this is what we can do differently, all that kind of thing. And you're going to end up with some sort of systems that you want to then implement.
Mhm.
So just some examples. The classic ones is like prio, vision, prio, which means we push the waves, then we go for vision, then we push the waves again. People often don't skip out that second one. Or we need to know who's tanking, who's are we burning, turning or burning? A classic ones. Everyone likes a bit of
Nice.
alliteration. Like, are we finishing the Baron or are we leaving it? Who's going to be responsible for that? So you're going to gradually try and make all these systems that work for your team. And I think we both agree if it's coming from the whole team, that's the goal. But again, scrims almost never come down to Baron because by the time that you get to 20 minutes, one team is so far ahead that they can set it up however they want, really,
Mhm.
because they're just going to win anyway. Or it doesn't even matter because by that point, the game's already lost or won, depending on what side you're on. And so, genuinely, you might go through a whole week of practice. Probably shouldn't be your only objective for this reason, but you might go through a whole week of practice and have, I don't know, 6 games a day. You might have 1 or 2 games a day where Baron actually really matters,
Yeah.
maybe. So you might go through a week of practice if you're in the LEC and have like 3 or 4 examples of it. Whereas if I could say, okay, for today, like we talked about, maybe not every single game. Well, let's say I'm doing it for every single game just for the sake of argument. All 6 games, we're going to start 20 minutes in a roughly even game state. That means I know that every single game, Baron will matter,
Mhm.
regardless of whether we take it or we don't take it. But it is an important objective. It's not really an important objective. Well, if one team is 8K ahead, it's not an objective in the same way because it's like one team just can take it when they want it and the other team can't really stop them. So that would be a really big thing for me is to get repetitions of things that come up more in competitive games than come up in scrims. So
Yeah.
competitive games, I mean, it'd be really interesting. I don't know if there's any analysts watching this who work with professional teams. What percentage of your professional games are within 1 or 2K gold lead at 20 minutes? What percentage of your scrims are within 1 or 2K gold lead at 20 minutes? I would expect that one of those is going to be way over 50% and one of them is going to be way under 50%.
Yeah.
And so to be able to just recreate that whole area of the game, for me, that's I think the right way to be thinking about it and the right way to go about it.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think, I mean, your focus there as well, just on talking about communication. Like, yes, okay, it might not come up in every competitive game you play, but like it could be crucial that in the mid to late game you look to secure a Baron. And are you comfortable just talking to each other about how that should be thought about? What are you looking for to decide to go for it or not? And just giving players like a few more few
Mm,
more reps
mm,
to just figure out how we discuss it in the moment.
mm,
Um, that's the kind of takeaway where I think, you don't want to come up with too much that's um, like a checklist of you have to say this and then you have to say this,
mm.
but
Of
more
course.
your training maybe just like situational awareness. Like, what are you looking for? What could we be looking for to decide to go or not? And how do you communicate that? And can we do that a few times and figure out what's really meaningful for us? And also just words. Like I remember, this is going to be a bad example because I can't remember exactly what the objective was. I think I was working with a team once, and it seemed like Baron was a crucial objective, and everyone was sort of like, "Go Baron." Consensus was met. The team moved, shifted across the map to try and go get Baron after a kill, perhaps. And on the way, I think one of the players stopped to get Scuttle Grab. Could that hopefully
Yeah,
that's
yeah, yeah.
roughly what happened. And then moved on to Baron, and then they actually lost it in a fight,
Mm,
even though it was very low.
mm.
And it was like, to me, I was sitting back in my naive way, I was thinking, "Go Baron" means different things here. It
Yeah,
means
yeah,
directly
absolutely,
or go via Scuttle
absolutely,
Grab. So,
absolutely.
like, working that out in this multiplayer tool will be
Mm,
useful, I think.
mm. Yeah, I think the main thing for that is just to know that it's a problem. So I think you can also work out that kind of thing quite not easily, but in a
Oh, true.
sensible
Yeah,
time frame.
true.
In
Just by
scrims,
reviewing.
too. Yeah, by just making sure that you know that it could be an issue, that it could be something that you come across. But I mean, it really does depend. The downside, I think, would be, again, if you can fully customize everything, this downside doesn't exist. But if it exists as it does now, which is you just have this button that presses to get forward 30 seconds, firstly, it's going to be annoying because everyone's going to have to wait on base while one person presses the button over and over and
Mhm.
over again. And secondly, you are going to be in a situation where, okay, right, it's 20 minutes and the game's even, but all the towers are down and no dragons and no grubs, which is never going to happen in a game.
No.
But you would still get the chance to set some things up. But again, if we talk about Baron, that's a good one because the way you would set up that objective, the way you would control that area requires a lot more space. The towers kind of need to go down. Otherwise, the enemy can be just too close safely. So there are definitely some problems with it. But I would say my main takeaway, if we sort of start to wrap up this point, my main takeaway would be, from my side, I feel like it can't be a bad thing unless it's
No.
misused. As in, either this is a tool that I almost never use because it's not implemented particularly well, or it's a tool I use a decent amount because it's implemented quite well, or it's a tool that I could use a lot, probably never as much as just scrims, but
Mm.
maybe if it was implemented perfectly, which is I can choose the exact situation, then I would probably use it a huge amount.
Mm.
So for me, it's there's not really that much of a downside. Although I do agree, poor implementation of this is worse than not doing just what everyone else is doing.
Yeah. That's my one, like, wish for the world of competitive league will be, coaches, please, please put yourself in your players' shoes when thinking about how this is gonna work. So, we know from a lot of reporting in sport that constant interruptions to practice, having players standing around watching while the coach talks, gro uh, gripes, moans is not the best feeling in the world. Like, it's not gonna be, like, the most useful spent time. It's just gonna be pretty draining, and players might check out. So I think, yeah, just put yourself in the player's shoes, like, use it well,
Mm, mm.
obviously.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, especially in the context of the work that I've done over the last few years. But when I was first coming up coaching league in sort of 2013, 2014, even especially, but even for the first kind of 4, 5 plus years, I almost always found myself on the side of, let's maybe not let the players decide everything about
No.
what they're coaching, etc., etc. But I do think actually that nowadays, in the last few years, we've very much got a danger of going the other way, where, okay, from a very simplified point of view, you might say, oh, it's such a shame, I really want to do all this fun stuff, but my players just whine and they say they
Mm,
only want to play scrims and all that kind of thing. And yes, you should never just give in because they're whining about something, but also you should really take it seriously that practice shouldn't be about you.
no.
And it should involve fun, and it should involve stuff that the players want to do, and all that kind of thing. And yes, I don't think, if you really believe in something, you shouldn't let it go badly once and then never happen again. But also, if you try something a few times and it consistently doesn't go well, you don't need to permanently stick to it. So it's almost like I've kind of bounced back and forward. I do think there's a danger that we're going to be overcorrecting and have a
Yeah.
bunch of coaches, especially with a tool like this, just say, right, we're going to play only the first 10 minutes for the first week, and then we're going to play only the next 10 to 20 for the next week, and all that kind of thing. But in the right situations, I think it could be really, really useful. Um, Another
100%.
example that just came to my head there. There was a thing for a while that we used to call rogue time. There was a specific time of the game. I mean, it's still sort of going, but for a while they were incredibly good team, incredibly good laners, and actually incredibly good in the late game. But there was this part in the middle that always seemed to be their struggle moment. And hopefully, with this, you can at least just say, right, we're going to start from 15 minutes. We have to get to 25 minutes without losing the game, and then you get a bit more practice. Uh, the problem is with these kind of discussions, we've got another example, which I'll use, and I'll try and I did want to try and move us on to the first of our questions, but
Well, sorry to rehash, but that's a great. I mean, that's there is now the big question for coaches. And as you say, this will probably separate the great coaches from average or poor, but deciding what to work on.
mm,
And what you've said is like players will probably also pick up on the fact that they're perceived to be a poor mid-game team, and therefore the coach selects that to be used
yeah,
in the practice tool. So that is like a nice.
mm,
It's maybe a bit too general. Like it might not be as precise as it could be, but like that's a good starting point. So
yeah,
I think that's a nice way to think about getting buy-in to do it.
mm, yeah,
Just
definitely,
one other thing on the involvement of players, I think touches on this. Repetition and drilling is proven to be important. Or I can't remember what the comment was I saw, but it was like proven to be. It was known to
yeah,
be fundamental to improving performance. Like a lot of those ideas stem from things that link to deliberate practice
mm,
and the work of a researcher, a guy called K. Anders Ericsson, and he put out a paper that identified a range of hours to achieve an expert level of
yeah,
skill development.
yeah.
And everyone will know there's an average of that, which is roughly
Malcolm Gladwell
10,000
uses,
hours.
yeah,
Yeah. And there's been like this uncritical adoption of this idea of a rule, like you've
yeah,
got to practice for 10,000 hours. It's
yeah,
not that misinterpretation, whatever. Hopefully people can look into that. But the deliberate practice idea, there's been some wonderful work recently that explores more of a framework of deliberate practice, and the underpinnings of it are that you can't engage in deliberate practice, which is very sort of intentional, not always fun, very deliberate, working on something with a specific outcome. Um, Underpinning that, there are certain conditions. You've got to have the resources, you've got to have enough rest and recovery and energy to engage in those practices, and you've got to have motivation. So you've got to have the motivation to do it. And that motivation can be stemming from things like I enjoy being here, I enjoy being around the people I'm around, and I have some say in what I'm doing. Those are fundamental aspects of motivation. So being aware of that is also like
mm,
we're not just drilling.
mm,
Players have a voice. It doesn't always have to be telling us what we do, but at least they feel heard, maybe, is a
mm,
useful starting point.
yeah.
Anyway, I'm waffling, but yeah,
Yeah, I think it's
all
really
good
important
coaching
to
practice.
consider. It's like the futsal example or the Thai boxing, all that kind of thing, where you find out that these areas that have massively overperformed historically, it's due to fun. Like it's
Fun,
it's it's the
right,
fun way to repeat these skills in a much more easy environment. Which
right.
also, again, actually, I do think with the practice tool is a really good thing. I think it's a problem that when we scrim, we have to scrim people that we know because they're going to be as good
Mm,
as us. If you're in the LEC, you kind of have to scrim other LEC teams or the very top of LFL, for example. But that means if you lose, yes, it's practice, but I lost to someone that I know. And even if if I take it to the extreme, players have a big input on who is on the roster. And if you
mm.
play badly in a scrim or you're testing something out and it doesn't go well, it genuinely can have a bad impact on your future prospects and on your future career. And so, if we could be in this situation, which is further away from a game because you started at 20 minutes with all the gold or whatever it might be, then
Yeah,
maybe that takes a bit of the edge off. Now, of course, there's competition in drills, and you want to beat the people you're playing against, but it's not quite the same when it's okay. We're going to do a 5v5 like header game in football, as opposed to I'm playing a full 11
yeah,
somewhere else from another
yeah,
team, especially. So
yeah,
hopefully we can do that. And the other thing as well is that it will be a big advantage for teams who have 10 players, 5 academy players and 5 main players, for example, which I think again is just another good thing for the scene in the long term.
yeah,
Not that we obviously have any control over this, but I do think it's important to have these almost incentives. So you don't have to have an academy team, but here's some tools that you can use, and you can either try and convince a different team to let you use those tools. Let me play a game where I'm ahead and you probably will lose, but we'll practice it and then you get to do it the other way round. That's a much harder sell to another team than it is to our own team, because you know it's going to come back. You trust that they will give you those games where they're trying it with a gold lead rather than you, etc., etc. But yeah, I do think that's really important, and being able to practice these situations. So the
Yeah.
last example that I'll give is this T1 roster that's currently just won back-to-back worlds. They are famous for having unbelievably good Baron setups nowadays, and it's the T1 Baron. And they turned around so many games. They won this world. They won the last worlds because of it. They would have been knocked out in best of fives if they hadn't have, like, okay, the best of five was 3-2, but in that game three, they just stole a Baron when they were like 3k down or 4k down or whatever it might be. Stole it as in set it up very quickly and did it very quickly, whatever that might actually entail. But really, when you look at that roster from the beginning, it was the exact opposite. The T1 Baron became a thing because they threw so many games by starting Baron and doing Baron, and just, oh, we didn't have the time to do it, unfortunately, and we all
Whoops.
died. And so many games that it was literally like, oh no, they're going to Baron again. But they gradually got better. And of course, you won't be able to recreate the pressure when you're doing this in a multiplayer tool, but you will be able to get more reps of the movement. But
Mhm.
love your point from the beginning. Make sure if you're doing this that we're not isolating things too much. It's not too
Yeah.
sanitized. It's not we're all standing in exactly the right positions and now you have to just click Baron and do it.
Yeah.
It's wider area of the game, but still an area that um,
Yeah.
we can't do
That's
without.
you've just linked it so well together as well. Like learning is really strongly impacted by emotion, and the emotional difference, like the emotional experience, is so different between competition and practice. So you might be picking something up just great in a practice tool with against five subs that you don't perceive to be on your level, but then you put it into competition, your retention of that learning is going to be very different because of or your ability to reproduce it. I think you've we don't need to keep going back there, but it's you've highlighted that maybe just an without you don't even need to overthink the whether this is going to be good or bad. It's just you have a way now of just underscoring a practice environment. Like if you enter into the multiplayer practice tool, it's so obviously just practice. We can just think about practice, and we don't need to worry about looking good in front of an opponent that we respect or stuff. And it could give maybe more room for experimentation and creativity and maybe tolerance of mistakes because it just doesn't matter. It's practice, and could be really positive. I wanted to also, do you think teams will pick up more players now because of it?
No.
So like, no, okay,
The short answer is no. I think that the teams that do will be more rewarded for it, and maybe in the longer term, people will.
mm,
But I won't say who, because I'm sure they'll be public about it if they want to be. But multiple different organisations that I was talking to in this off season are really trying to push this idea now of like one club. Actually, now let's finally think about what we might do with an academy team, rather
mm,
than just not think about it. And when you don't think about it, it means that you're trying to win as many games as you possibly can with the money you decided to spend that year, which isn't exactly the most efficient way in the long term to run an academy project. But a lot more teams are doing it now. So
yeah,
I'm hoping that they'll just be more rewarded, and then gradually we'll see that behavior change. But I don't think it'll be quick. Okay.
right.
So that's it for the first topic. If you have any thoughts on that, love to hear it down in the comments below. We want this to kind of be a bit of a discussion. Either we can reply there, or if there's more, if there's enough more, we'll talk about it again next week. So the other things that I wanted to talk about is I have a couple of questions. Now, when I first started working with coaches, I put a tweet out saying what's the questions that you would ask or the things that you're interested in knowing. These are the first two questions that came back. So we're going to go through them again here. And I'm sure someone might remember my answers back then, but you feel free to compare because it might be very different. Although I think the topic technically is the same. So the first question: what is the most important skill for a coach to have? We'll say in esports, but I don't know if it applies to anything else.
Phew, that is, I mean, that is such a Important question, no doubt. You know, I was reading there was a book chapter out in 2015 called The Sports Coach by Cruikshank and Collins. Excellent sports coaching researchers, and they highlighted some of the key skills. Emotional intelligence, which is,
A
it
big
sounds kind of
catch-all.
big catch-all term.
That's the problem with this actually, in a way, as I was thinking this when I was researching it as well, is you just find all these massive catch-all terms where it's
Yeah,
like really the most important skill is the one that can catch the most things all at once.
yeah, true, true.
But anyway, okay, so emotional intelligence.
Well, if we can unpack that a bit more, uh, and I'm not saying it is the one, but I think that within emotional intelligence, you have two sides of it. There's your ability to understand, to recognize, accurately recognize and understand the emotions of other people. Your ability to accurately recognize, understand, and manage the emotions of yourself. Um, if you have a good handle on both of those things, you could say that you are good with people. What is coaching if it's not being good with people?
Mm,
So that's probably somewhere in there.
okay, I like that.
But but I mean, caveat and boring answer as well would be y- you are every coach will be working with a unique set of people with unique needs. And it could be that you're working with a group that just wants instruction, that just tell me how to do this. Like maybe it's I don't know if they have them in bouldering, for example, but if I go bouldering, I want someone to explain to me the grip. How do the grips work? Just tell me.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
you know, I don't need you to sympathize about my my rough start to the day, like my poor night's sleep. Like just tell me, you know? So professional knowledge 100% is in there.
Mm,
And, it's very tough because I've also at the higher end of things, you see things like, are you do you have micro political skills? Can
okay.
you if you're in a you exist in a complex system, like a sports organization, there are different hierarchies in there, there are responsibilities, requirements, expectations, limited resources. Can you push the right buttons, pull the right strings to get the things that you need down the line? That's probably important. It's also
Mm,
important for job security. Like, can you keep the right manager informed about what you're up to
mm.
keep preserve your job going forward? Oh man, I mean,
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
adaptability. Yeah.
This is good because
What came up?
yeah.
What
So
did
I
you
have a
come
bit of
across?
a different one. This is the other reason why I really like this kind of format where we can both look at things separately and then come together because I think you're going to always end up with more.
Confusion?
No, no, no. I was going to say more the more academic side of things,
Right.
or like more. I'm gonna be always coming at it from I think a more basic level,
No, no,
more
no.
basic as in like
IRL
okay,
level.
yeah. Basically, what I wanted to say is that I'm not going to be reading. This is my excuse for not reading papers whenever we have these topics. So I'm going to be like listening to podcasts from coaches talking about it,
Yeah,
or listening
great.
to or reading. Like I can do articles. I can read articles, but my eyes just glaze over halfway through a paper just from the way it's written. But that's a
Yeah,
separate point. So
sympathy.
the place that I started, which I like, and the same one that I started with before, is the Olympic Committee made a list of the 10 skills to be an effective coach. I'll read them all and then I'll say what I think for esports. So they had number one, understanding of the sport. Number two was an eagerness to learn or being a lifelong learner or a sponge for knowledge. Number three, they've called sharing knowledge.
Mhm.
Number four, motivational skills. Number five, knowing the athlete. Number six, communication. Seven, listening skills. Eight, discipline. Nine, leading by example. 10, commitment and passion. Now, I guess you could kind of lump a bunch of those together and call them emotional intelligence, like
Yeah.
sharing knowledge, knowing the athlete, even motivational skills. I think
Yeah.
motivational skills end up more being about knowing the athlete and knowing what they need rather than necessarily being an incredibly forceful speaker. Although I do think completely separate point. I do think that's something
True.
that coaches should learn a lot more than they do.
True.
But for me, and this is absolutely a cheat, and I cheat shamelessly, I would put eagerness to learn or being a lifelong learner as number one. And
Okay.
here's my argument for that over emotional intelligence and stuff like that, although maybe actually emotional intelligence is a great counter because maybe this doesn't apply here, is that if you become really good at learning stuff, you can learn whatever you're going to say is the, the most important coaching skill. So that was my
Oh, I
pre-prepared
see.
my
Right.
pre-prepared argument. But
You're a trick the
genuinely
system.
in esports, I think genuinely it's so important. And even in the Olympics, where sports are likely to be unbelievably old and very set in their ways, they've still got this as number two. And we're in a space where every 2 weeks the game changes, every year the game changes dramatically. Suddenly you've got an entirely new tool that we never had
Yeah.
before. And even if things weren't changing from an actual practical point of view, the game physically changes, there's also a massive amount of change just due to the fact that we've not been doing this for very long and we've not been
Yeah.
doing this professionally for even less time. And so we do things now because we did them 5 years ago, but 5 years ago we just did them because whatever, we didn't really think about them. So every year new stuff comes out from just the collective knowledge of how we play. So for
Yeah.
example, I remember the year where a team started really playing on two lanes very effectively. And it's like, okay, now they do it. Now everyone else has to learn this. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And okay, right, in the current state of the game, you can actually open on two lanes and play them in a way that you can play both rather than one. And so we stopped doing the classic like let's all just go mid type idea, and we
Yeah.
started like the next stage. And that's not actually due to the game changing, although maybe you could argue it is as well, but it's to do with our thinking changing. And so the space is so dynamic that you need to be just constantly being able to learn, and everything else I think comes secondary to that.
Yeah.
So
Could I, let
yeah,
me,
jump in.
maybe I love that one. I would say, is it enough? Here's one from left field. What about the ability to sell?
Mm,
So you have you're fantastic at learning.
yeah,
You pick things up quickly, you understand them.
yeah,
Can you convey them to others and get them on board with it?
yeah. So here's the part that is a complete cheat is that I think you can learn how to sell things. So I'm
Oh,
I'm not even talking about learning the game, really.
yeah,
I'm talking about learning how to sell things, learning how to communicate, learning how
yeah,
to actively listen,
gotcha,
learning how to read cues from other people, all those kind of things.
gotcha, yeah,
I just basically don't believe that people are particularly good at stuff or bad at stuff. I mean, obviously, we have different starting points, but my favorite communication teacher, he often shares a video of how he talked at the beginning because he constantly gets, he was a public speaker, gets paid whatever it is, 150 grand to go and speak at events with tens of thousands of people there. And people are like, "Oh, you were always good at communicating, weren't you, Vin?" And he just shows them this video of
it
10
was
years
not.
ago, and he can't even look at the camera. And he's like, yeah, hi, my name is Vin." And he's like
Oh,
so nervous. Whereas now it's like he could sell anything.
right,
And that's what I mean is not necessarily learning the game. To be honest, I think, understanding the sport for me comes below this. So even if we talk about the fact that you could learn the sport, it's just that idea of constantly looking for the next thing, constantly learning, constantly pushing yourself.
yeah.
And I think you can learn how to do the other stuff, which like I say, I do realize this is a bit of a cheat. So the only, I guess, counter would be, can you learn emotional intelligence?
Yeah, well, we'll get sciencey for a second, but I mean, there are schools of thought that say emotional intelligence is a trait, like on the level of personality that you you sort of you possess, much harder to change. There's another level where maybe it's an ability that you can work on, and in the right context, you can exercise a higher level of it, and then there's just the knowledge of it. So even with a good understanding of it, maybe we can apply it to some level. So I would say yes, there's probably some. I've seen emotional intelligence trainings for coaches,
Mm,
and they're often around drawing attention to our emotions. So just daily journaling, things like that seem to help. But yeah, I think learning it underpins all of that. And to your point, if a coach doesn't believe in the idea of learning and adding to their toolbox, you can imagine they'll be quickly overtaken by the coach that is
mm,
open enough to want to learn. So I can get on
mm.
board with that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess the other thing as well is that this is not really learning. This is yeah, I can't even fake this to be into the same the same topic. But while I completely agree that emotional intelligence is unbelievably important to be a coach, it's different levels of importance depending on your role as well. So there is
True.
space for very, very technical coaches who maybe even never interact with players particularly.
Right.
You know, like we have this weird thing in esports in LoL, especially of almost kind of looking down on analysts as if they're like not important. And sometimes, okay, you know, if you're talking about a data analyst, then maybe they have to just spend time with the data. But in a
Right.
sense, I think there is really a space for people who I have a huge amount of knowledge about the game and I'm not good at all with people and I can't work on that. That doesn't mean you can't be a useful asset to a team. And there's probably the opposite. So for a head coach, I would say emotional intelligence is maybe the most important thing in terms
Mm.
if we ignore this learning one that is a bit of a cheat. And then there could be other roles that fit you better if that is the case where you really struggle with this kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, brings into like sometimes there's some literature in sports psychology around um, compassion and caring for others, and actually the toll it can take to be. I hope I'm not misrepresenting this body of research, but it's sort of like y- you care so much about other people's experience, you empathize so much about other people's experience that it so heavily impacts your own, and how that can can reach a point where it's a threshold for burnout even.
Mm, yeah.
I can't remember what it's called, but I'm not doing it justice. A quick shout out to Peter Varga, former data analyst at Fnatic. He spoke about the need for a data analyst, especially in esports, to have the emotional intelligence just to work effectively with the coach, who might
Mm,
not always know what they wanted.
mm,
So yeah, it was like, yes, we have all access to all this data, but like, what do you want? And being able to elicit that
mm,
with sensitivity, with
mm.
care.
Yeah,
But
it's
yeah,
a
no,
big one.
you're right. You're all right. I think if you're in an office working on yeah, go X's and O's, playbook strategies, maybe there's a different hierarchy of
Yeah,
needing there, but learning would be central to it.
yeah.
Good one.
Okay. So the follow up I've got is how do you therefore get better at learning? Now I've got some ideas that are just absolutely experiential, and then also the people I've told it seems to also help there. But I'd
Hmm.
love to hear your point of view and the more. Uh, it's like I always use this example. Bit of a tangent, but it's okay. There was an MMA coach for us, Sahabi, who I'm a big fan of, who was working with a bunch of fighters, but one of the maybe greatest fighters of all time, George St. Pierre. And he was trying to get into coaching after his career. And for us, I can't remember exactly how he worded it, but he's like, I told him you have to be careful because yes, you've coached one person to the best level yourself. That doesn't necessarily mean that you can coach anyone else.
Oh, right.
So this is what made me better at learning, but that doesn't mean it's going to make you better if you're listening to this. But for me, I think the thing that I always tell people is there is so much to learn in the way the world is now. And you know, go on YouTube, find 100 of the best professors in the world that would be even 10 years ago way out of your reach to ever listen to, and you can listen to hundreds of hours of them for free, or even full courses for free, or just a huge yeah. So absolutely any topic you can learn. That's not for me kind of an excuse. It's more just I don't have the motivation to do it.
Mm,
The thing that I always tell people is start with what interests you, be led by your curiosity. And then as you do that, you'll gradually get better and more comfortable with the idea of learning and you'll start to enjoy it more, picking up new knowledge more. So, okay, if you're really interested in chess, for example, study chess for a while and study it properly and listen to people who teach chess. Or if you're really interested in coffee, do that for a while. Like look into something that you know you like already. You don't need to start with here's some science papers about coaching,
mm,
therefore it's going to make me a good coach, because that's going to be such an uphill struggle that you gradually get better and better. Okay, I don't like books so much, so I'm gonna listen to a podcast from a coach instead,
Yeah,
or whatever it might be. I can do an audiobook, or I can do, like I say, YouTube. I think is an absolutely fantastic one. And the more you do that, and the more you see it applied to your own life or to your own coaching, you'll enjoy it more and more. And I
yeah,
think one of the things that I love so much about coaching and about this space is that there's nothing that's not useful, really. I mean, there's things that are going to be different degrees of useful. Yes, you might get more knowledge from reading a book specifically about coaching than reading a book about traveling the world. But there's
mm.
probably things in the Traveling the World book that will make you a better coach, or psychology, or even logic and mathematics, or economics, or behavioral economics. For example, recently did a massive dive on a guy called Rory Sutherland just because it was super
Oh yeah,
interesting to me. And there's loads of stuff there that's going to change the way that I approach coaching, but also change the way that I approach building a team or structuring a week or anything like that, which I didn't really expect going in, but it was just an interesting thing to look into. So just let yourself be led by that. So
yeah.
what would be your advice? How do you become better at being a learner, or better at being a lifelong learner is the vernacular
Yeah,
that we use.
that's always I've seen that one before as well. Like even after retirement, I have to carry on learning.
Yeah.
Yeah, uh, but it's yeah. I think you've 90% overlap with you. I think motivation is at its core, and maybe slightly counterintuitive. I actually think that, and this isn't just my thinking. I'm basing this on academic work, but the you as I mean, we have according to one theory of motivation, self-determination theory, we have innate needs, and when these innate needs are fulfilled, we experience a higher quality of motivation to do those things, to do that activity. And actually, if you start with any activity, if you experience some improvement in it, that's one of those needs that is met and will increase the quality of motivation you have to do that thing. So if you've already got a head start if you're remotely interested in something, and then if you can find the right sources to give you that just feeling of like just incremental improvement, like that's gonna be a wonderful thing to support your motivation. Equally, I think having some connection with someone in that environment, and that can be someone that maybe doesn't know about it but is interested in your progress in it, or it can be a role model who's immersed in that world and can really sort of like help pave the path ahead of you. Those will be hugely motivating and keep you progressing and wanting to progress, which is I think really fundamental to learning. Um, and having the possibility in your life to actually structure your own learning a little bit. So university degrees are challenging, and also partly because students don't have a great deal of say over how it goes. Like you have this 3-year window to do it. You have to attend lectures on a certain on a let's say daily basis, and actually it can grind some of the fun out of it, and it can become difficult, and maybe that can be detrimental to your learning. So obviously not criticizing sort of schooling or university there. It's just when we are forced to do something, our motivation wanes. So therefore, if we can find ways to do it more on our own terms, it can be very healthy for learning. Um, the precursor being, are you in a good, are you looking after yourself? Are you putting yourself in a physical and mental health space, for want of a better word, to be able to engage in learning? If you've got horrendous health habits, then it can be very difficult to learn and retain information. And at the other end, once you've progressed down this sort of I'm motivated to do it and I've got role models and I know how to progress, it becomes part of your identity. And once it's part of your identity, I think you're unstoppable. If you see yourself as a coach, well, actually, that's oof,
Hmm.
not maybe you feel like you've made it and you stop. But if you're in the right
Mm.
environment
Mm.
and you see that, if you listen to Just John and you hear that, like, to be a good coach, you have to engage in lifelong learning, that becomes part of your identity, then
Mm.
off you go.
Mm.
So I think motivation is core to it,
Yeah.
and then good role models around you that
Mm.
encourage you. And actually knowing the way to this is maybe a bigger challenge for esports coaches. Is like how do you ca you're presented with like such a blank canvas. Like, do you really know from starting out what's going to be big bang for your buck steps to improvement? I think
Yeah. I don't
that's
think you
really
do.
hard.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really interesting. One of the books that I would like us to go over at some point on this on this show is by Cody Royal, and it's Seven
Mhm.
Hard Truths of Being a Head Coach. One of them, he's talking about it in a different context, but it's interesting. You use the wording is you are not a coach, you're a person who coaches. And so
Ooh,
that would
yeah.
be an interesting one to delve into at another stage. But it just reminded me, I was looking it up, it just reminded me of a book from Cal Newport. I was looking at my notes on it, called So Good They Can't Ignore You.
Mm.
So he's the guy who wrote Deep Work and stuff like that. And in this book, he's saying you shouldn't follow your passion, basically. It's better to find something, work at it and get good at it than it is to find your passion.
Yeah,
And I think I'm right in saying the things he says that we need to thrive is he has autonomy, competence, and relatedness,
that's
so
it.
connection with
Yeah.
others. And he said we mistake passion for autonomy a lot of the time. But just this idea that starting to get good at something is the thing that um, feeds off itself. And that's what comes back to again the same advice we were talking about before, where once you start to build up that autonomy, you build up that competence in an area, then it will start to become more rewarding to do it more, and then it just kind of snowballs and snowballs.
Yeah, 100%. Those 3 needs, autonomy, competence, relatedness, they are they are part of the self-determination theory big picture, and it's astonishingly powerful, I think, in different contexts. If you give people the opportunity to experience those 3 needs to a high degree, like, it feels like you can move mountains with people, I think, and especially in gaming. Like, the gaming experience is, you jump onto a game. Let's say you're free to play whenever you want. You've got that autonomy to decide when you engage with the game. You quickly experience competence because the game is just so perfectly built to give you the right feedback at the right time and the right challenge to make progress. And then it, it clearly shows you this is how good you are now. This is how far you've come. That's motivating. And then you enter into esports, so you're not just sort of gaming in isolation. You're connecting with other people, and you like those people. Just reinforces it. So
Hmm.
yeah, I think this is quickly becoming the motivation podcast, and I'm completely biased in that way of thinking, but I love it.
That's it's really interesting as well because it ties back into what you were saying near the beginning and some of the dangers of stuff like the practice tool
Right.
is that you should be aware of this as a coach to not accidentally squash it in the
Yeah.
people that you're coaching, and that can be a real big massive impact on people. And now I'm this is exactly why I wanted to do this show, because I'm like recontextualizing a bunch of things you see quite often. Players who are incredibly good who get onto teams, and maybe they even do well on really relaxed teams, and then they get into a professional team and they say, oh, I've stopped being in love with the game or whatever that might be. And I think a lot of times it's actually to do more along this thing.
Yes.
So suddenly you've had that autonomy for so long, and you've loved that autonomy about the way you play and when you play and all that kind of thing, and now suddenly it's gone. You join a semi-professional team, and maybe it's still there mostly. You're playing in the evenings or you're playing in the day, but your coach is just kind of there to just make sure everything happens. And that can actually be a great thing. And so
Yeah.
you have a huge amount of autonomy, and you have a huge amount of competence, and you're friends with the people that you're with. So you have a lot more on that relatedness point of things. And then you join a professional team, and there's a danger that if you're overbearing as a coach, you can absolutely squash not only the autonomy but the competence as well.
Yeah.
If suddenly we have to play in a specific way, we have to only engage when it's exactly the right time to engage, and when we've said that we're going to engage and everyone said that they're ready and there's confirmation 3 times or what, we've got really strict structures around that. Suddenly, not only are you taking away their autonomy, but then they're going to fail at it, and suddenly you're taking away their competence as well. And obviously it's a massive hit to
Yeah.
motivation, and it can be damaging for the structures in the team to affect their relatedness as well. So it's almost like if you're overbearing, you can quite quickly do the trifecta of squashing every single area.
Yes. Absolutely. You nailed it. You've nailed it. And we have research on this. We've shown the contrast between the pro player progresses through the game until they're 16, 17, 18, enjoying all of those freedoms, and like every day they jump on, they get a little bit better, and they start meeting new people, and it's hugely motivating. They go into a coaching environment, and suddenly the coach is making all the decisions. They have to turn up at a certain time on a certain day, and they don't know who they're playing with and they haven't really got any connection to them. Like pulling the rug out from underneath them, it's a stark contrast to how to why they started. So coaches, I think, really benefit from even being aware of that. And then, funnily enough, there's some nice research, and I'm spouting now about research here, there, and everywhere, but it's just fascinating. There've been pretty solid research to suggest that actually those behaviors, we call them controlling coaching behaviors, those behaviors often stem from the coach themselves feeling controlled. So where does the coach feel controlled? Okay, pressure from the org to get results, a perception that they have to do well, otherwise they're not going to get not going to get their next contract. Like their financial livelihood depends on performance. So they in turn control, and maybe they feel isolated because who does a coach have to turn to really open up? And who's going to give them meaningful like support and feedback that really knows something about their world? And those feelings put pressure on the coach, and that can equate to more controlling behaviors on the players. And then one more thing, just final thing for the players as well, at the highest level of the game, this idea of competence, like a big part of competence is not just knowing that you're good, but also knowing how to improve. And the very highest level of performance, sometimes it can be hard for that pro player to really know how to improve. And it can be hard for the coach to know exactly what they need to do to improve. So we call it needs thwarting when those needs aren't met, and need satisfaction when they are met and continue to be met. And it's eye opening when you think about it in that way. So it's
Mm.
crazy you came across it in a book though. That's brilliant.
Yeah, yeah. I think a lot of this stuff ends up tying back, tying back together, and
Yeah,
it's just so
yeah,
interesting to kind of recontextualize all that stuff and just to allow maybe a bit more, allow a bit more freedom and allow a bit more control from the players side of things. And I think as well, obviously biased, but so much of what you're saying is coaches feel like that because they don't have the support
right.
to know what they want and to know what they want to get out of the team, but also to consider this kind of stuff and to run that kind of thing by people, and to just say, right, I want to do this. How do I make sure I can do this exact thing that I want while also not completely squashing my players' autonomy? Like, is there a way to do
Yeah,
that? And I think, yeah, having that support and just having a space to talk to someone about it is just already such a big step. Okay, so we'll move on to our last question then. This was the second question that I got. So we've covered the what is the most important skill. How much should you adapt your style when coaching a team? Again, a kind of impossible, impossible question in a way, but hopefully an interesting discussion.
hmm. Yeah. Oh, so I'm immediately thinking about authenticity. So you, as a coach at a certain level, have a certain way of doing things that is hopefully authentic to you. However, you enter into a new environment. You are working with a new group of players. You're going to need to adapt to some extent to them and be responsive to their needs. Uh, I don't think I have a super concrete answer for this one because
Mm,
it's hard for me to imagine. I can't really quantify the benefits to not adapting
mm,
versus adapt
mm,
because it could easily say that every coach should adapt. Like walk into a new setting, immediately change how you do things to fit your players. But at the same
mm,
time, your players probably they might be aware of your reputation. They might be excited to work with you. They might be eager to learn. Maybe you've coached a player to the highest level, and they want that to receive that same coaching. So they're like open book. I'm ready to receive the knowledge.
mm,
um, and so going in day one and no one willing to like express how they want to do things or what they stand for can be
mm.
tough. So
Yeah.
maybe it's yeah, hard to answer. What do you
Yeah.
think?
Well, I think pretty much the same. The thing for me that I was thinking when I was prepping for this is you really have to be true to you. That's your like authenticity piece. I think a really important thing is you have to know what you believe in. You have to have gone
Mm,
through that process of saying, why do I do the things that I'm doing? And why do I believe the things that I believe? I think non negotiables are a really interesting thing. Of course, I ask all the coaches that come on Coach Talk, What are three non-negotiable behaviors that you and people around you
Yeah.
need to buy into? I wouldn't quite describe it as a trap question because I'm not sure non-negotiables should exist, but I think it's just a really interesting one. And I think, as with a lot of values that we talk about in high performance, and I'm mostly talking about organizations here that talk about their organizational values, and then as soon as push comes to shove, they don't have those. If you want to say something is a non-negotiable, you really need to properly think it through, and you need someone to play devil's advocate and say, okay, so what if, the example that you could use if you're an organization is like, well, we don't want anyone who's toxic in solo queue. It's like, okay, well, what if Faker said, I really want to come to your organization, and then you found out he was toxic in solo queue? Are you going to say no? Because, okay, maybe you are, in which case, sure, we can call it a value. But if you're not, then it's not a value. It's just this thing that we say sometimes.
Yeah.
So I do think you have to be kind of true to yourself and authentic. But I think it is worth genuinely thinking about, are there things that I wouldn't budge on? Are there things that I think are non-negotiable? Simon
Mm.
Cox used this great expression when I asked him that question. Is he didn't quite say, I don't think non-negotiables should exist, but he says we should make sure that there are things that can bend but not break.
Mm.
So you might have
Nice.
quote unquote non-negotiables, but it's not like this has to happen. It's more like this thing is important to me, and how it will happen might change. Or, if you say, right, I want everyone to be hardworking, it's like, okay, what does that mean? And how do we show that to people around us? Because hardworking in this team might be completely different from hardworking in that team. And that's the part that changes. But both times we want it to be hardworking. So I think the big thing for me when you're thinking about this question as a coach is, before you go to the next team or before you go to just wherever stage you're at, make it conscious exactly what you are doing and why you're doing it, and see if, okay, the why I'm doing it might not change. Even if everything that I'm doing completely changes, the why I'm doing it might not. So I really
Yeah.
believe that players should have autonomy and competence and relatedness. So I make sure that everything I do fosters that. Right. But what I do with this team that fosters that might be completely the opposite of what I do with the next team that fosters that. Um, but the other thing that I do think is really important, and it kind of goes counter to this in a way, I guess, is that something that we don't do enough as coaches is think about ourselves and what we need. Hence the whole coach support idea. When we often, as head coaches, are put in charge of kind of creating the culture just by default, because there isn't a culture for a team, because most teams have never done this step and there's no consistency between years. So every year we burn it all down and start again. So if you're coming in that year as that coach, you by default get to be in charge of the culture. Not only should we do a lot of stuff around that, but the first step that I would always ask coaches that I work with is, what do you need to thrive as a coach? And that's something that we often miss, where we say, okay, right, I'm going to make sure I get a lot of stuff from the players. I'm going to ask every of them, what are your values? What are your drivers? What are the things that inspire you? And maybe they all want to be really relaxed and fun and enjoying all that stuff. But you have to ask, what do I need as a coach myself? Maybe I'm the exact opposite. Maybe I really need it to be super disciplined. I need to know its work. Okay. Maybe if it's that extreme, then maybe you'd be better with different players and they'd be better with a different coach. But
Mhm.
at least to ask that question, so that again, how much you need to be adapting and how much is actually something that makes you much better. So there will be situations where, look, and I've literally said this to players. We've had players that didn't necessarily get along so well with, but still managed to gradually build up that kind of mutual respect back and forward. And at the end of our time together, just said, look, you would be better with a different coach. I would be better with, we would both be better in different situations.
Mm.
But I wish you all the best. You've got
Yeah,
you've
yeah,
got a chance to be absolutely amazing. But the kind of coach that you want is not me.
yeah,
And so I think that again is also something to consider. But all of this only possible if you know what you want to do and why you want to do it.
yeah, absolutely. It speaks to your point about values, isn't it? Maybe they're not organizational, but they are personal. And if you identify as a professional coach and professionalism is a value, you can work constructively with people, even if you're not best mates. Um, yeah, no, interesting point. I think a lot of that aligns with what I would put out there. Um, you can bend and not break what you stand for. You can retain some things, and they look different in every context. You can. There's a lot of work about not a lot of work. There's some interesting work about care in coaching. You care about being a coach. You care about the people you work with, and you align to a duty of care, which is like the minimum standard of practice you have to engage in to be safe. And you can apply those things in all the contexts, and they look maybe different. So care is not to say that you are soft in your approach always. Care is taking care to understand what is in the best interest of the group that I'm working with and how can I give them that. So just one example, I was working with a team once where after I was coaching, I think in the end for like 3 seasons, but I think in the middle of the second season, one of the players said, "I wish you'd shout at us a bit more," like because the soft approach was fun and brought the team together, but they were looking to take the next step and they
Mm,
wanted a bit more of
mm.
a firmer coach-led environment
Yeah,
because they had other things going on and they wanted to come into training and not have to think so much themselves and not have
yeah.
to answer so many questions. So
Mm,
and 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 care is taking care to figure that out and give them that.
mm,
So
mm. I think that's a fantastic example as well, because that then ties to what I was saying before, where there's some people who are either not able or very much would not like to be the person to be a bit more firm and a bit strict. And sometimes I agree, sometimes you need, one of my clients said this once, sometimes you just need someone to slam the table. Which I really like. It's like in a best
Right.
of five. I think he was using that as a context in the context. Sometimes
Yeah.
you just need someone to stand the table and be just we need to get down to like some sort of minimum standard here rather than overcomplicate things. But there are coaches where that is going to be really bad for you, to be shouting and to be strict and to be punishing people who are behaving badly or whatever that might be. And that's what I think is important to consider as well, is not just do the players need this, but what do I need? It's
Yeah.
not, because I'm just always nervous that we tend to sort of sacrifice ourselves at the altar of the players' needs in a way. We can do that with
True.
the culture, but we can also do that with, well, they needed someone to shout at them. Then you end up shouting at them, and then are miserable for the rest of the day because you just shouted at these people that you care a huge amount about, and
And it's not you, yeah.
it's not you. Yeah. So I think there's some dangers there, but definitely some flexibility is good. It's not. I don't know how useful this all is as an answer, but hopefully you can let us know down below if that's a useful answer or just an interesting discussion.
Well, yeah, I mean, you've made me think just about how could you in advance think about how far you're willing to change and stretch and can you? Like, do you
Mm.
have the knowledge to be able to do what you do with a different approach? So
Yeah.
and going back to your learning, how can you learn to be more adaptable and what would that look like? All very interesting questions.
Yeah. I think
Yeah,
you can
good.
absolutely learn to be. I would say the first time you go over your coaching philosophy, it's going to be way worse than the fifth time. That's going to be
Yeah,
worse than the sixth time. So you absolutely can learn, I think, to start thinking this way. And again, talking about learning other stuff, you start reading some philosophy books or listening to philosophy discussions. You start to get used to thinking about things in a deeper way or a more abstract way, and starting to think, okay, where actually is that limit? And maybe you can also practice self reflection of like, okay, where is that limit with
yeah,
me? If I do prefer the softer approach, what would I do in the more strict approach? Like, what would I be okay with and what would I not be okay with? Can I genuinely make someone upset because it's the best thing for them? I mean, we'll couch whether that ever would be, but let's
yeah,
just pretend. Um, or is that something that's going to be too sort of damaging to
yeah.
me?
I mean, that's definitely a done thing, like ticking someone off deliberately to spark a reaction in a moment. I'm sure there are instances of that.
Mm,
Uh, I mean, Michael Jordan talks about it all the time, doesn't he? Like,
yeah,
I picked someone to deliberately
yeah,
tick me off.
yeah. Yeah, yeah,
Anyway,
and even that the last dance, I actually have used this with a team once, because I have maybe it's not a non-negotiable, and again, this probably needs too much time to unpack, but I'm going to say it anyway. I really don't like us being nice to each other. And I use
Mm,
nice as a very specific word, not kind. I like us being kind to each other, absolutely. But I don't like us being nice to each other. And so I used all those clips from The Last Dance of people talking about Michael Jordan and saying, like, oh, he was just an asshole. Like, he was not a nice person. But I also would never have been as good a player if I
ah,
hadn't have played with him, or whatever that might be. So I think that's a very interesting one. Not that we should go around and insult each other, but still definitely something that is worth talking about. Like how nice do I want to be as a coach? How kind do I want to be as a coach? And how strict do I want to be about my standards? And the other
yeah.
thing you talking about adapting. This is not part of the question, but how much you do adapt your style when coaching a team. What are your thoughts on how much you should adapt your style when coaching a person, each
Ooh,
individual? Because the thing that I would always say is that I think we should treat people fairly. Probably, I would say we treat people equally, but I'm not really sure what that means. But absolutely, we shouldn't treat people the same. I think
yeah,
that's a real that's not an effective way to coach, but also just an effective way to live life. Because I know that, for example, I won't say who, but on a recent team, there's one player whose sort of self-talk and what he thought about himself was unbelievably harsh. So I don't think I ever said anything kind of bad to him because he said it to himself. Probably
mm,
said it to himself out loud. If he's had a hand in losing us the game, or even if he's had a hand in winning us the game, but he made a mistake, he's going to have told himself that that's awful more than I have, more than I would. And then the opposite is true, where there's some players who, on that same team, there was a player who wanted to be kind of pushed and wanted it to be tougher and loved the idea of like, you can be great and I expect great things from you and I will
yeah,
tell you when you're not being great, and that's how we're going to do it. And is there's definitely not the same. Is it equal? Is hopefully it was fair.
mm.
But how much should you adapt when you're coaching individuals, or is there a problem? I mean, obviously there's problems with that approach when they see different things, but is there actually a problem with that approach in your mind?
I think that's really the essence of coaching, isn't it? Like adapting to the person, and this word needs gets thrown around an awful lot by me, but I think just being aware of the needs of that individual and constantly checking that too. So people change. I say it a lot, but Alan Watts, I think you're under no obligation to be the person you were 5 minutes ago. I think I've said that even on this podcast before,
Yeah.
but or coach shop before. But it's yeah, check in with people, understand that they can change, that you can change, that any moment in a day you might be slightly feeling slightly different and might be acting slightly differently, and what I need to give my player, what my player wants, uh, could be different. So yeah, certainly I think for the most part we we want to be fully aware of that. Of course, you could also say like when times are tough, people want to know what to expect from you, and some
Mm,
people might say, "I want to see consistency,"
mm,
and yeah, I think I'd struggle if that was the case because they're
mm.
just everyone is different. You know, we all have different backgrounds and experiences, and there's value in that.
Yeah.
And I was thinking just yesterday about how this idea of culture being a uniform way of thinking, acting, and behaving, but do we lose some unique qualities in that, and how can we bring that together? And yeah, I'm offering a little bit, but I think certainly adaptability to the individual very important. And actually, maybe that's where it's an interesting caveat because it could be like you're different in your one-to-ones, depending on who you're talking to, your approach, because you understand their needs and preferences are a different level, different. At the team level, maybe you're Mr. Consistent or the coach is
Mm,
consistent.
mm,
And maybe that helps people feel comfortable in some
mm,
teams because they know what to expect and what they're going to get. So,
mm.
you could imagine it could be really powerful if the coach is a bit of a hardliner in the group setting, but then pulls you to one side and gives you a lot of time and kindness and
Yeah.
encouragement. Like
Yeah.
that could be quite
Yeah.
quite powerful.
And something we will cover on a future episode will be this
Great.
balance of kind of horizontal and vertical, because I think that stuff is like so interesting. Or But the other thing is that it comes back to what we were talking about before, where it's like the maybe iceberg is not the right idea, but like the top part, the surface level could change with each person as long
Yeah.
as the depths stay the same. The roots, there you go. That's
Mm.
much better.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
tree can branch out and be different at the top, and each different branch can be a different person, but the
Love that.
roots stay the same. And for that, you need to know what your roots are so that you can
Love that.
firstly know that they're not going to change, but also be confident in, right?
Yeah.
I can treat people differently because I'm treating everyone with what they need in the current situation, prioritizing their, mental health and wellness first, and then their performance second. And that's the thing that's
Yeah.
the most important to me. And I know I can do that with everyone, even though that will look different to each different person, or if it might be different, whatever your kind of philosophy and your grounding is.
Yeah. I love that. Yeah.
Okay.
Cool.
Well, that's all the topics for today then. So thanks everyone for watching. Let us know down below if you have any questions either for future episodes. We can probably just answer them on YouTube as well, but we can take them into future episodes and discuss them in a lot more depth. Or if you have comments on things we've discussed here, one of the reasons that we're doing this is to kind of just get that conversation going and talk more about some specific and practical things that you can take to improve your coaching.
Fantastic. What a
Great.
good one that was. A great deep dive.
Great.
Great questions.
All right.
Exciting times for league.
Yeah, exactly. All right. See you guys.
Adios.